They told the townsfolk it was a place for healing. They lied. In the year 1882, between the fog-heavy ridges of the Allegheny Mountains, a pale stone building rose from the earth like a wound that refused to close, the Western State Hospital. But no one in town called it that. To them, it was simply the asylum. A place where the light didn't touch the windows, where names were forgotten and replaced with diagnoses, melancholia, hysteria, mania. Where you didn't hear screaming because whatever was inside those walls made sure the screaming never began. This was not a place of medicine, this was a place of obedience. The official histories say lobotomy began in the 1930s, but they don't tell you about West Virginia, 1882, about Dr. James Wheatley, about the surgeries that didn't have a name yet, the ones done without anesthesia, without sterile tools, just a mallet, a hand-forged chisel, and a set of iron restraints. He called it correction. The state called it treatment. And the patients, they didn't call it anything at all, because most of them never spoke again. Before I go any further, where are you listening from right now, and what time is it where you are? Think about that for a moment, because the hour matters more than you think. The first recorded subject was a woman named Margaret Bell, 26 years old, institutionalized for excessive sorrow after the death of her child. That was her diagnosis. Grief. By the time Wheatley was finished with her, she couldn't even remember why she'd been sad in the first place, couldn't remember anything. She moved differently, she blinked less, she stopped using her voice. Wheatley marked her file with a red X. Improved. She was the first, not the last. 3 more followed in quick succession. Women whose crimes were as small as reading after midnight, refusing their husband's touch, or talking. To themselves in a field, they were moved into Ward C, a place for quiet containment. Iron rings in the floor, wooden beds that could be bolted down, no windows. Wheatley refined his method there. No anesthesia, gags soaked in laudanum to keep the patient from biting their own tongue. Entry made through the thin bone above the eye socket, sometimes with a carpenter's awl instead of a surgical pick. Fast, crude, merciless. One of them, Elizabeth Tyne, woke during her own procedure. The records say she showed unusual resistance to calming effects. But after that day, she never responded to her name. She just stood at windows, motionless, mouth slightly open, like she was waiting for something to be placed inside. An orderly swore she would mirror every gesture you made in perfect silence. Raise your arm, she'd raise hers. Blink once, she'd blink once, but never on her own. And at night, she was always barefoot, always standing in the exact center of her cell, never lying down. Her file read the same as Margaret Bell's, a red X. Improved. The truth was, Wheatley wasn't curing anything, he was building something. By the winter of 1882, the changes in Ward C were undeniable, but no one outside the asylum's walls was allowed to see them. The women there didn't speak, they didn't scream, they didn't even seem entirely alive. The junior staff whispered about the Ladies of Whisper, Wheatley's personal projects. The senior physicians turned a blind eye. After all, a quiet ward was a manageable ward, and in the currency of 19th century psychiatry, silence was gold. But silence has a weight to it. It settles into the stone, it seeps into the air. The laundry logs tell the story no medical record ever would. Blood-soaked pillowcases replaced in bulk, cloth restraints chewed through at the seams, heavy linen sheets burned rather than washed. Resistance was building, but it wasn't loud. It was in the refusal to eat, in the messages scratched into bed frames, in the shattering of chamber pots during night shifts. Wheatley's answer was always the same: more procedures. He began experimenting with a variation he called the temple insertion, striking at the side of the skull to elevate response. The first subject was Clara Thomas, a young black woman committed for nervous agitation and refusing to work in the asylum's laundry. She didn't survive the restraint process. The death was noted as a collapse due to female frailty. Within weeks, 2 more colored patients received the same operation. Both ended up compliant, silent, but something else began to spread. It started with a man named George Allen, one of the few male patients Wheatley allowed to be operated on. Allen had been a preacher before his commitment. He was treated by a ward boy who had overheard Wheatley's instructions and wanted to try it himself. No license, no training, just a hammer and an awl. From the day of his procedure, Allen hummed a single low note from waking until sedation. The same tone, broken, hour after hour. At night he carved 4 symbols into his wall, a cross, a spiral, an eye, and what the orderlies called the hook. When Allen stopped humming, other patients began to wail, deep animal cries that carried through the halls and made the attendants abandon their posts. One woman, lobotomized 6 weeks earlier, was found kneeling in the asylum's empty chapel in the middle of the night, her face pressed to the cold stone altar, humming the same pitch as Allen. No one had unlocked her door. The staff called it post-procedural residue. Sister Agatha, the nun assigned to Weston, called it something else. She left her post the next day. The only words she wrote before disappearing were, "Their silence is not peace." By 1883, staff resignations had doubled, and the few who stayed began developing their own rules. Rules never spoken outside the building, never admit anyone to Ward C without a second signature, never enter the supply room after dark, and if someone starts humming, you do not hum back. The official State Board inspections in 1883 recorded Western State Hospital as well-managed and remarkably calm. But those reports were written by men who never stepped foot into Ward C. The truth was buried behind locked iron doors, where light didn't enter and names didn't matter. Among the surviving private journals of the staff, one name appears over and over: Mary Ellen Keene. 28 years old, committed on the recommendation of her parish priest for persistent religious fervour, not the sort that wins sainthood, the sort that unsettles people. She wept during Mass without reason. She told the deacon's wife that the communion bread already had a name. She claimed she could hear angels sobbing beneath the chapel floor. Her husband signed the committal papers himself. Religious hysteria, visual delusions. She entered Weston barefoot, not from poverty, but because she said the floors had already been walked upon by holy feet. The attendants laughed, but within weeks they weren't laughing anymore. Mary Ellen never blinked, not when struck, not when sedated, not when cold water was poured over her in the bath. Her pupils contracted in candlelight, dilated in darkness, but the eyelids never closed unless forced shut. At night, she stood over the beds of other patients, whispering things they couldn't understand. "The breath is still," she'd murmur. "Let me call it back." One woman scratched her own face bloody after a night in the same dormitory. An elderly man known for his silence began shouting, "Close your eyes! For God's sake, close your eyes!" The orderlies summoned Wheatley. Though no longer officially listed as the hospital's attending physician, he still roamed its halls, his influence unbroken. His notes on Mary Ellen describe her as lucid, hyper-spiritualized, suffering from self-directed hallucination, and then, in a phrase that it repeats in his writing like an obsession, "Inward stare must be broken for normality to resume." June of 1883. Mary Ellen was moved to the remnants of Ward C, now used as Wheatley's private surgical prep. The room had been stripped of beds, outfitted with a wooden table bolted to the floor, a bone awl, a dental chisel, iron clamps, linen soaked in whiskey and lye. No anesthesia, only a bite guard. The first strike cracked the orbital bone. The second displaced it. On the third, she screamed. Not in pain, but in what one nurse, Miss Devlin, called a voice not hers. Her words were never recorded in the surgical log. But years later, under a pseudonym, Devlin wrote in a Baltimore medical journal that Mary Ellen's litany was in no known language, yet it was understood by all who heard it. The attending orderly dropped the mallet and fled the room. Wheatley, according to Devlin, only smiled. After that day, Mary Ellen no longer spoke. She stood at her cell window, pressing her forehead to the glass for hours, and every night the humming returned, low, unbroken, carrying through the vents until morning, not just from her cell, from every cell in Ward C. By late summer of 1883, the humming had spread beyond Ward C. It was in the men's wing, the laundry, the chapel. The sound was always the same, a low, sustained note carried on breath that never seemed to run out. The attendants began stuffing rags into the vents at night, but it didn't matter. The hum wasn't just carried through air, it was carried through walls. One orderly, Richard Palmer, lasted less than a month on staff before carving the words, "I see her eyes," into the underside of his bunk and vanishing without collecting his pay. Another, a kitchen hand, was found sitting cross-legged in the pantry, humming in perfect unison with the patients 2 floors above, eyes closed, smiling faintly. He claimed he was listening to the inside. The few physicians who still supported Wheatley's methods began to notice a pattern. Patients who underwent his corrections, whether orbital, temple, or what he called the split ridge method, all began exhibiting the same reflex. If you spoke to them directly, they would stare at a point just past your head. If you tried to block that gaze, their pupils would adjust to something behind you. And then there were the symbols. The hook appeared first, carved into wooden bed frames, scratched into the stone floor beneath chamber pots, drawn in condensation on the barred windows, then the spiral, then the cross, then the open eye. One of Wheatley's few surviving notebooks contains an odd margin entry next to a patient log. Hook, spiral, cross, eye, sequence unknown, possible key. By this point, the State Board had sent auditors to review Weston's practices, but the inspections were a farce. The auditors were only shown the bright wards, the sewing room, the occupational wing, the gardens. Ward C's door remained locked. Wheatley's defenders claimed it was under structural renovation. The real renovation was something else entirely. In a letter smuggled out by Sister Agatha before her disappearance, she wrote, "They are breaking the head to open the gate. The gate is not of this world." The phrase, breaking the head, appears again in an unsigned memorandum found in the asylum's archives decades later. In the margins, another hand had written, "Obedience first, then opening." No one knows exactly when Wheatley's work stopped being about controlling the patients and started being about what they could see. But by autumn of 1883, it was clear the procedures were not designed to heal. They were designed to tune. Mary Ellen was the centre of it. She never ate in front of staff, she never lay down, and she never blinked. The night before the first frost, a janitor making his rounds found her standing in the middle of Ward C, with every other patient gathered around her in a perfect circle. They were all humming the same note, and she was smiling. The night the humming stopped began like any other. Damp air pressing against the asylum's stone walls, lantern light flickering in the long corridors, the faint drone vibrating through every beam and pipe. It ended differently. Shortly after midnight, the note that had been constant for weeks began to falter. Not all at once, but like a thread unravelling. First one voice dropped out, then another, then another. By 12:47 a.m. the building was silent. No hum, no footsteps, no cries. The orderlies called it a blessing. It wasn't. At 1:06 a.m, an attendant on the second-floor men's ward heard a sound like knuckles rapping against wood, 3 times, then again, louder, from inside the locked cell of George Allen, the preacher who had carved the hook into his walls. When the door was opened, Allen was standing barefoot in the centre of the room, staring at the floor. In front of him, carved into the wood planks with perfect precision, was a spiral. Not scratched, not gouged, etched as if by a single unbroken motion, deep and smooth. Allen's fingernails were intact, and he was smiling. By 1:15 a.m. the knocking had spread, in different rhythms from different cells all over the building. Wheatley, summoned from his quarters, ordered the patients restrained, but the moment the straps were fastened, the humming began again, not low and steady this time, but layered, Harmonies and counterpoints, voices weaving in and out, dissonance that made the lantern flames shiver. The staff tried to drown it out. Doors were slammed, floors stomped on, even buckets overturned. It didn't matter. The sound moved through them. Miss Devlin would later write that she felt it in the roots of her teeth. At 2:02 a.m., the chapel bell rang. No one had touched the rope. The patients went silent instantly. Every single one turned their head toward the chapel at the same time. Mary Ellen was no longer in her cell. The east wing door to Ward C, bolted from the outside, was open. What happened in the chapel that night was never recorded in any official log. But in a resignation letter written by an attendant named Samuel Brigg, he described walking into the nave and finding Mary Ellen kneeling at the altar, her hands pressed flat against the stone. Surrounding her were 32 patients, all facing inward. Their eyes were closed, but their bodies swayed in the same slow rhythm. When Brigg called her name, Mary Ellen lifted her head and looked directly at him. And then, without opening their mouths, every patient in the room spoke at once. 3 words. Brigg never wrote them down. He said later that writing them felt too much like saying them. He left Weston the next morning. After the chapel night, Weston State Hospital was no longer the same. Patients who had never undergone Wheatley's corrections began showing the same symptoms. The unblinking stare, the barefoot pacing, the carving of the 4 symbols. It was as if the condition had become contagious. Wheatley didn't see this as a failure, he saw it as proof. His surviving notes from late 1883 are the most disturbing, not because of what they describe, but because of what they assume. There is no more language about mental illness, no mention of hysteria or melancholy. Instead, he writes of tuning frequencies, aligning sight lines, breaking the head to open the gate, and again, the word opening, always underlined. Ward C itself was subtly altered during this time. The old patient rooms were stripped of furniture, their floors marked with chalk in patterns no one could later decipher. The iron rings in the floor, once used to hold restraints, were now placed in strange symmetrical arrangements. Some were newly installed in rooms that had never held patients at all. One entry in Wheatley's journal is particularly chilling. When the hum aligns, the door will know its frame, the eyes will be the hinges, the breath will be the key. Whatever he was building, it wasn't for the state, it wasn't for medicine, and it wasn't for the patients. Mary Ellen was moved permanently to the chapel after that night. She was never seen outside of it again, but the hum began and ended with her breathing. When she inhaled, the patients inhaled. When she exhaled, they exhaled. Some staff believed she was leading them. Others believed she was only a mouthpiece. Then came the blackout. November 14th, 1883. At exactly midnight, every lantern in the asylum went out at once. Matches struck by staff refused to spark. In the dark, the humming grew louder than it had ever been. But it was no longer just a sound. It was inside the skull, vibrating the bones, tightening the chest. Those who were there say they could feel their thoughts slowing down, as if something was pushing them to the edge of forgetting. And then, light. Not from the lanterns, not from candles, from eyes. Every patient in Ward C, and some from other wings, stood with their eyes wide open, pupils white and glowing faintly. Even in the pitch black, the glow was enough to cast shadows on the wall. Wheatley stood at the center of them, arms raised, whispering something in a rhythm that matched the hum. One attendant swore she heard him say, "The frame is ready." The blackout ended at 12:17 a.m. The lanterns flared back to life. Patients collapsed where they stood, unconscious. But from that night forward, none of them slept lying down. The state's arrival in early 1884 was not because of rumours, not because of resignations, not because of the whispers leaking out of Weston's taverns about glowing eyes in the hills. It was because of numbers. In less than 2 years, Weston State Hospital had tripled its patient intake, yet recorded fewer discharges than any other asylum in the region. Families who committed their relatives never saw them again. And in a place where paper trails were sacred, the trail here was full of gaps. The Board of Lunacy and Charities sent 2 inspectors. They never made it to Ward C. According to later testimony, Wheatley met them in the administrative wing, presented them with ledgers filled with perfect, even handwriting, and guided them through the women's sewing room, the laundry, and a spotless ward where sedated patients smiled faintly at the wall. The inspectors signed off on excellent sanitary and moral conditions. Their report made no mention of the Eastern Wing, but the staff noticed something that day. For the first time in months, the humming stopped completely while the inspectors were in the building. Not diminished. Silenced. Mary Ellen was not in the chapel. Ward C's bolts were drawn tight. The air in the East Wing felt heavier than usual, as if the building itself was holding its breath. When the inspectors left, the hum did not return for 3 nights. And then, on the 4th, it came back. Wrong. Not the steady tone, not the layered harmonics, but a broken, stuttering rhythm, almost like someone trying to speak but choking on every other syllable. The sound unsettled even the patients, who began avoiding the chapel altogether. Wheatley doubled his procedures in those weeks. Files from that period are marked not only with the red X, but with a new symbol, the hook, drawn in the corner of the page. Those marked patients were never seen again, and their names do not appear in the burial registers. The few orderlies who dared whisper about it claimed those patients were being moved somewhere beneath the chapel. It was around this time that Margaret Keane, a nurse who had worked at Weston for over a decade, wrote in a private letter that the foundation stones do not match the rest of the building. She claimed there were older passages beneath the East Wing, carved from a different kind of rock, and that some of them had been blocked off long before the asylum was built. Wheatley, she wrote, had found a way in, and what he was doing down there, no one wanted to see. 2 weeks later, Margaret Keane was gone. Her resignation letter was unsigned, her room stripped bare, her name scratched from the payroll ledger. But in her locker, folded inside her apron, there was a scrap of paper with just 5 words on it. The hinges are turning now. They said the passages beneath the chapel were storage, forgotten coal chutes, root cellars from the days before the asylum. That was the official explanation. But the stone down there was older than the rest of the building, older than the town, and it wasn't empty. The first written account of what lay beneath came not from Wheatley, but from a young attendant named Horace Delaney, the same physician in training who once assisted on a transorbital correction for a 15-year-old girl named Louisa Clark. In his diary, Delaney described following Wheatley one night in February 1884, slipping behind him as he unlocked the door behind the chapel altar. The stairs descended farther than the building's foundations should have allowed. The air grew colder, the stone darker, smoother, as though water had polished it for centuries. The walls bore shallow carvings, spirals, hooks, open eyes, the same 4 symbols Alan had carved into his cell. Some were large enough to stand inside. At the bottom of the stairs was a circular chamber. In its centre stood Mary Ellen, barefoot, wearing a hospital gown so thin it clung to her skin. Around her were 12 patients, equally barefoot, each holding a lantern that cast no light beyond their own faces. Delaney swore the lantern flames bent toward her as though pulled. Wheatley stepped into the circle, holding something in both hands. A small pine box. He opened it. Inside, Delaney saw a tuft of hair and a strip of linen marked with initials. One of the patients began to hum, and the rest joined in. The same note, the same low vibration. The stone under Delaney's feet trembled. Then Wheatley looked up and spoke a single sentence. Delaney couldn't remember the words afterward. He remembered the sound, the way it seemed to press against the inside of his skull, turning thought into static. He remembered Mary Ellen's eyes, as glowing faintly, the pupils narrowing into vertical slits, and he remembered the floor opening, not crumbling, not cracking, opening. The circle of stone in the centre sank a few inches, and from the gap between it and the surrounding floor, a rush of air poured out, wet, warm, and smelling faintly of iron. Delaney fled before the circle fully descended, but in the days that followed, he noticed changes in the patients who had been there. They no longer hummed, they no longer carved symbols, they no longer moved at all unless guided by hand. Their files were stamped with the hook symbol, and they were listed not as deceased or discharged, but simply as quiet. The chapel door to the stairs was sealed 2 weeks later with a new iron lock. Only Wheatley had the key. The night the key vanished, the asylum was under a hard frost. Windows were crusted with ice, breath hung in the air, and the hum, which had been faint for weeks, had stopped entirely by dusk. Wheatley was last seen in the chapel at evening rounds, standing in front of the altar with his hands clasped behind his back. He wasn't praying, he was looking at the floor. At 3:12 a.m, an orderly named Harris awoke to the sound of metal scraping against stone. He followed it to the east wing and found the chapel door ajar. The key, normally hanging from Wheatley's belt, dangled from the lock. The stairs below were dark. Harris didn't go down. He went to find Wheatley. The superintendent's quarters were on the 3rd floor, above the administrative wing. The door was shut, the gaslight inside still burning. When Harris knocked, there was no answer. When he opened it, the heat hit him first. A wet, oppressive heat that had no business in a January night. Wheatley's bed was untouched. His boots were neatly aligned at the foot of it. On the desk sat the pine box Delaney had described. Open, empty. Next to it a sheet of paper covered in Wheatley's compact script. The door will not close again. It knows I am not the first to use it. I fear it will not be the last. On the floor, arranged in a perfect circle, were 12 lanterns. Their flames burned without flickering even when Harris stepped between them. And in the center of that circle was a wet imprint of 2 bare feet, the toes pointing toward the desk. But the strangest thing was the sound. It wasn't the hum, not exactly. It was breathing. Slow, steady, and close. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though the room were alive. When Harris backed out of the quarters, he found that the hallway lanterns had gone dark. In the faint light from the desk he saw footprints, wet, barefoot, leading away from the room. They trailed down the hall, past the stairs, and toward the east wing. They stopped at the chapel door. The key was gone. Wheatley was never seen again. By dawn, the staff found that Ward C was empty. Every patient from the east wing had vanished without a sound or struggle. The bolts on the windows were still locked, the outer doors still barred, and under the altar in the chapel the stone circle was warm to the touch. The state's investigation began with urgency and ended in silence. When officials arrived in February 1884, they found the east wing boarded over, the chapel stripped bare, and the remaining staff tight-lipped to the point of terror. The official report, preserved only in fragments, lists abandonment of certain wards due to structural instability as the reason for closure. Ward C was never mentioned by name. But survivors, those few staff and patients who hadn't vanished, told a different story in letters never meant to be archived. One nurse, in a letter to her sister, wrote that the air in the east wing felt thin and wrong, as though it were being drawn elsewhere. She swore she heard the faint hum coming from under the floorboards at night, pulsing like a heartbeat. An orderly described seeing the iron rings in the patient rooms rust clean through in a matter of days, as if something in the air was eating the metal from the inside out. And a janitor named Ellery Webb left behind a single page in his diary before he, too, disappeared. The circle is open all the time now. There's no more sealing it. At night, the breathing comes from the halls, and sometimes it breathes in when you breathe out. The ones who went down there, they're not gone. They're still here, just behind something thin. By spring, the chapel was bricked over entirely. Maps of the hospital were redrawn without Ward C. New patients were placed in other wings. The east wing was declared off-limits, pending demolition, though no demolition ever came. The public never knew. Families were told their loved ones had died of fever or been transferred to other facilities. Death certificates were forged. Western State Hospital operated for decades after, but staff who worked there swore that certain nights, always in the deep cold of winter, the bricks in the chapel wall would stubble to eat. Sometimes the air in the east wing would grow warm, as if a hidden furnace had been lit, and those who lingered too long claimed to hear faint humming from somewhere below, joining in with the rhythm of their own pulse. As for Wheatley, his fate remains unrecorded, but in 1937, during minor renovations in the administrative wing, workers found a rusted lantern wedged between floorboards. Its glass was intact, and inside the soot-smudged chimney was something burned down to ash, except for a single scrap of linen. The initials were still visible, and written on the chimney glass, scratched so faintly it could only be seen in angled light, were 5 words. "The hinges are still turning." That was the last time anyone tried to open the chapel. But if you walk past the old East Wing today, if you put your ear to the bricked-over wall and wait, some say you can still hear the breath. And if you wait long enough, it might start matching yours.